Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Bangert, and it's my privilege today to introduce Johann Sebastian Bach's Cantata number 70. The title of the cantata is Wachet, Betet, Betet, Wachet, which means in English, watch, pray, pray, watch. These are words that are taken from the Gospel reading for the day on which the cantata was written. I hope to introduce this to you today by doing three things. One is I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the cantata, and you might look at that as a kind of a short lesson on how Bach fulfilled all of his duties in Leipzig. And then, secondly, I want to grapple a little bit with the texts that this cantata brings forward to us. Not only the librettos themselves or the libretto itself, but also the Gospels which back up the libretto and which gave birth to the libretto. And then the third thing I want to do is to give you one or two things to think about each movement to listen for as you hear the cantata. So that's what we propose to do today, and let me start first of all then with the origins. Prior to coming to Leipzig, Bach had two major positions. The one immediately before was in Caton, a small little city that had a prince who loved music a great deal. And the one before that, that is two positions before Leipzig, was a stay at Weimar, where he worked for the Duke there in his castle. He came there in 1708, having left Mühlhausen, and stayed there in Weimar until 1717. So he was there nearly 10 years. The first part of his stay, he was employed as concertmaster, which meant that he probably played a good deal of violin. Also meant that he had some keyboard responsibilities. In fact, it's in Weimar that he wrote a good part of his organ music. And then in the year 1714, the Kapellmeister, that is a chapel master, died, and Bach took over the position. So from 1714 to 1717, period of 3 years, he was the Kapellmeister, the chapel master, which means that he was in charge of all the music for the Duke's chapel. Part of his duties then were to make sure that there are enough instrumentalists around and have some appropriate music at various times. But he was also responsible every 4 weeks to prepare a brand new cantata for the worship services held in the Duke's chapel. That was kind of a new thing for him to have that sort of regular responsibility. It turns out that one of the 4 week intervals ended on Advent 2, and so he was given the responsibility of trying to make a cantata for that day, Advent 2. And he turned to the court poet, whose name was Solomon Frank, or Solomon Frank, I suppose we could anglicize it. And Solomon Frank was a very favorite person of the Duke. He not only was the court poet, he was also the Duke's secretary. And I think that I read somewhere that he was responsible for the Duke's stamp collection. At any rate, Solomon Frank was a good Lutheran theologian with a bit of a mystical Lutheran bent to his texts. And he produced quite a few texts that have become for us favorites. One of those would be the Cantata 140, Wake Awake for a Night is Flying. That's also a Solomon Frank text. So Solomon Frank put together a libretto, and what he did was turned to the gospel for the day, which was from Luke 21. And the gospel contains all of these portents for end time nations rising against nations, signs in the sun and in the stars, all of those kinds of things. So, and then that ends up with Jesus giving the parable of the fig tree. And at the conclusion of that, Jesus says, okay, with all of that and the fact that the end time might be coming, watch and pray. And that's where the text of the cantata finds its origins in that third part of the gospel for the day. What Solomon Frank did then was to construct a cantata which consisted of 4 arias back to back. They were bookended by an opening chorus, which picks up some of the verbiage from the gospel reading and concludes with a chorale setting. So it consisted of 6 movements. And it turned out to be a rather good cantata, apparently. It was well liked. It was scored for soloists, a variety of soloists, and strings for the Weimar version of that cantata. We actually label this 70A as the predecessor to the cantata we are considering today. Now, when Bach went to Leipzig in 1723, he was full of energy and had lots of plans for what he would be doing there. And of course, he wanted to make a big impression in Leipzig and at the church and school. So he either consciously or subconsciously planned cantatas for every Sunday of the church year, excluding, of course, Advent 2, 3, and 4, which in Leipzig were not observed with fancy music, contrary to what he experienced in Weimar. So he had all these cantatas planned, besides which he had a new kind of duty there, since in Leipzig they had not only had one Christmas Day service, or Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, but they had 3 days of Christmas celebration. And it was expected of the cantor to produce a cantata for each one of those 3 days. Not only that, but Bach figured, listen, I think it's about time that I write a setting of the Magnificat. So it's in 1723, for Christmas season of that year, that he unveiled his well-known and well-loved Magnificat. So he came with some pretty large ambitions and rather strong ambitions. Now, how is he going to do all that? Well, one way he could do it, he figured out, was to recycle some cantatas that he had already written. And so when it came to be the 26th Sunday after Trinity in 1723, he recycled the cantata he did back in Weimar, 70A, Wachet, Betet, Wachet. And the way he recycled it is sort of interesting. First of all, the gospel for that day, the 26th Sunday after Trinity, is not the same gospel that was read for Advent 2. So there was some necessary adjustments that needed to be made, in spite of the fact that the new gospel, the one for 26th Sunday after Trinity, that gospel had a lot of characteristics that were very much like the previous one, Luke 21. For it talks about the wise virgins and the unwise virgins, and it ends up with talking about separating the sheep and the goats. So that's a kind of a new emphasis, but Bach wanted to somehow or another pull all of this stuff together in a single cantata. So what happened to recycle it is that he, or someone that he contacted, wrote 3 new recitatives, which were inserted into the cantata that he brought from Weimar. This enabled him, or enabled the sense of the cantata to sort of pick up some of the new ideas in the new gospel from 26th Sunday after Trinity. And it also provided a little bit of relief from these 4 arias in a row. And then the final two things he did, well, there are at least final two things, is that he made it into a two-part cantata. The second part, which would be done during communion, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And the third thing he did was to add a trumpet and an oboe. And then he also added one more chorale. Since to end part one without a chorale just not seemed right for him, and he added a chorale to end part one. So now we have a cantata which is expanded from 6 movements to 11 movements and tries to bring together the various thoughts and ideas of the various gospels that are involved and the emphases of the days. Advent 2 obviously has a little different feel than the end of the church year, although many of the themes are very much the same. So those are the origins of this cantata. Now we want to talk a little bit about, after a little drink of water here, we want to talk about grappling with the texts. We already said that the gospel for Advent 2, Luke 21, had these portents, as we call them, the signs of the coming of the Son of Man, nations rising against nations, signs in sun and moon, great disturbances in waterways and bodies of water, and earthquakes, and people generally walking around in a very foreboding feeling, kind of an existential dread that something really severe was going to happen. And so that's a part of Luke 2. Matthew 25 kind of picks up on the same idea. In fact, talks about the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds. And so there is this end time emphasis as well in that Matthew gospel. So what do we do with that? There's a long tradition within Lutheranism, within Christianity in general, I suppose one could say, to interpret these portents, as they are called, literally. In fact, many people wonder if the current situation with lots of wars and climate change and things like that are signs of the final coming. And so there's this long tradition of receiving these texts in a literal fashion. But biblical scholarship today is also asking us to consider some other things. 3 things in particular. One is that they have discovered that Luke particularly uses what we now call apocalyptic language and rhetoric in his gospel writing there. That is picking up these signs and talking about the signs and the sense of end time and existential dread is a characteristic and a tool that is used by many of the biblical writers, both Old Testament and New. For instance, it appears in Ezekiel a great deal and appears as well in the book of Daniel, shows up in the Gospels, and as we all know, it's a very strong emphasis in the book of Revelation. So it's a kind of a style of writing, a rhetoric of writing, which authors pick on in order to emphasize the importance of the time at hand and the seriousness of it, and it's the cosmic dimensions of what we're feeling. A second thing they ask us to consider is that, at least in terms of Luke and Matthew, both of those Gospels were written after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So fresh in everybody's mind is the destruction of the temple. And all of that means religiously and politically, and the horrors that those wars and periods of destruction brought on. And that's very vivid yet in their memories. And so the gospel writers are constructing their approach to this in such a way that they know that those memories are there and they're drawing on them and asking people to think about them and the current situation as a sign that the Son of Man is always ready to come. And so there's this sense that the Son of Man can come at any time. And so therefore we need to be alert and to pray fervently. Third thing that they would have us remember is that in terms of Luke and Matthew, to be sure, these accounts, Luke 21 and Matthew 25, occur in the gospel right before that particular evangelist's recounting of the passion of Christ, the death and resurrection of Christ. So they are asking us to move into these stories of passion and what's happening, knowing that the Son of Man is always around, and that as these passion accounts get read, people are to keep in mind that what is happening there in Jesus' passion and his death and resurrection is of cosmic importance and has relationship to all of the cosmic things and the existential dread that people experience in times of need and great difficulty. Now, in the Middle Ages, there's a whole lot of new baggage that gets dumped on these Gospels. It was the judgment of Christ, the judgment of God, became a popular theme in the late Middle Ages. Perhaps it was one way to scare uneducated parishioners. Perhaps it was one way to kind of control morality, which always seemed to be breaking away from norms. But it was a popular thing to do. All you need to do is to remember all of the paintings that were done in the early and late Renaissance period, where the artists were fond of pictorializing the judgment and people suffering in hell and so on. This was also the time that the very famous hymn Dies Irae, Day of Judgment, Day of Wrath, was written. It's a long hymn of many, many stanzas, which describes in great detail this judgment that is about to occur. And then remember too as well, Dante's Inferno is written in the 14th century, and it describes in great detail again what hell is like in the various parts of hell and how one suffers there and how one gets there and so on. So it's in people's minds all over. I mean, it's constantly there in artistic stuff, in the hymns that they sing, and the sounds that they hear, and in the stories that they hear and the stories they read. It's very much in people's minds by the time you get to even the 18th century, which is several centuries after Luther's Reformation. Just an example of this, by the way, J.S. Bach's great friend, Georg Philipp Telemann, wrote a setting of the Day of Judgment, which is what it's called. And it makes use of all kinds of musical materials, too, to develop agitation and dread. And of course, this continues well into the 19th century with the great works of Berlioz and Verdi, who try to represent these days of judgment with multiple sets of timpani and many trumpets from all over and so on. So this is a kind of a dominating theme. It's always there in people's minds. Now, we said a little bit about the 18th century, and we can say a little bit more. By the time you get to the 18th century, these themes are still there, but they are tempered a great deal by the mercy of God, and that God's answer in Jesus Christ is an answer to these threats of judgment, and that people who believe and are faithful are going to be protected from these disasters and evil things that are going to be coming upon the earth. So when you look at Solomon Frank's libretto, what you see there is that there's a kind of a persisting conflict of terror and comfort. And the singers and the people that are representing the cantata keep bouncing back from one side to another. First they experience terror, and then they experience comfort, and they go back and forth, and this persists in the cantata, movement after movement. And yet when you get to the end, of course, it's comfort that does win out, which we're happy for. And this is demonstrated in the text in a kind of obvious but not so obvious way. The librettist uses frequently, in more than half of the movements, the German word jedoch, 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 which means and yet, or nevertheless, or but, or yet. So those words are used in many of the movements. And in fact, the word itself oftentimes is a division point between a moment or two of terror and then a moment or two of comfort. So it's the switch that turns on the comfort. We'll want to listen for that. So that's the main idea that comes through Solomon Franck's libretto, together with the new recitatives and chorales that adorn it. As you think about dealing with these texts today, I mean, we all at some point come to the juncture of saying, what are we going to make out of all of this? I suppose we're well advised to think through about how we take these texts literally, and we each do that in our own way. But more than that, I think we should realize that what the librettist is saying about the jedoch is very much present. There is, especially these days with the pandemic and the difficulties of the world and its political situation, climate change and hurricanes that keep bouncing across the panhandle of Florida. When you think about all this stuff, there's a kind of underlying, often unspoken existential dread, I call it. It's a sense like, this isn't for normal, this is not usual. What's going on, and what does it mean? What else is out there? When is this day going to come, the disciples asked. And we kind of asked that too. So I think it's legitimate and it can be blessed to experience that. But we are advised through this libretto to experience it through this jedoch. That is, yeah, I do feel terror every once in a while, but nevertheless, there is comfort. There is the death and resurrection of Christ and all that that means and the promise of a new creation that has already begun. And then finally, I think we can be advised to be comforted by what the libretto does towards the end of the cantata, where it talks about the fullness of things and the fullness of joy of what is to come, and the fullness of joy for those who are part of the kingdom of God. And that fullness comes through the cantata very well, and we should wallow in it, as you will, and enjoy it, because it is a strong emphasis and one that comes through beautifully. So I might want to note one final thing before we get to the various movements. The images from the gospel that appear in the libretto are manifold. For instance, the libretto talks about the Son of Man coming on the clouds. It talks about lifting up our heads to greet the Son of Man. To lift up our heads also means to be secure, to feel okay about all this, and to be comforted. So that comes through strongly. The Son of Man is near. That is, there's always this sense that the end time is always around the corner. And to ignore that is to ignore what these gospel lessons are about and the cantata itself. And a fourth one that comes through is that the word of God will not pass away. In fact, those very words are used in one of the arias. So that comes out of the text as well. And then finally, watch and pray. Words that come directly from the gospel itself and become the motto of the whole cantata, in the sense that they sort of form the textual guts of the first movement. Let us then go to the various movements themselves, and I'll try to give you something to listen for as we move through the movements of the cantata. I'd like to say that the first movement is really kind of a collection of audibles, sonic signs, signals that we should watch and pray. It's full of it. The movement is full of these signs, and it would be good to know a few of those to be able to listen for them before they go running right by you and you miss it all, and you're not being watchful or prayerful. So here's some examples of what happens. As the movement begins, you'll sense that the string players are very agitated. There's all kinds of movement going on in 16th notes. In fact, in several places, which is rarity in Bach, got all the parts moving together in 16th notes. That's quite rare. And the effect is one of agitation and almost a sense of losing control. So this is kind of a terror thing going on there for sure. Secondly, that's covered with calls from the trumpet. So there are trumpet calls reflecting what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians and what is written in the book of Revelation, that when the Son of Man comes, he will come with the sound of the trumpet. And so the trumpet is constantly sounding. The calls are for us to listen to. Thirdly, about half a dozen measures in, maybe a little bit more, if you listen carefully to the bass line, it begins to rise by half steps chromatically. And by rising in half steps, there are probably about 6 or 8 in a row, maybe even more. It creates this sense of tension, like we're getting closer and closer to something, and we're getting higher and higher. We're getting to this point where we're actually going to see the Son of Man, and it increases the intensity. Listen for that. And then finally, and these are not the total amount of such signals, but these are some of the obvious ones. Throughout the movement, there's a kind of communal exhortation going on. At one point, the oboe and the trumpet, for instance, are throwing a little motive back and forth at each other. And they're encouraging one another. The soloists sing Wachet, or the choir sings Wachet. One voice says Wachet, next one says Wachet, other one says Betet, and they keep throwing it against each other, and they're yelling at each other and encouraging one another, in fact, to be watchful and to be prayerful. So this continues throughout the movement. And you have a sense that by the end of the movement, you're really into this agitation. This would be the time now to listen to a bit of the first movement. Probably measures 1 to 13 gives you a sense of how the very nature of the movement lands up. This is right before the choir comes in. We won't hear the choir, but the instruments give you enough of a sense of this. So, movement 1 measures 1 to 13. Of the cantata is a recitative. It's one of the new pieces, that new text that Bach had written for his Leipzig performance of this. And it continues in the same orchestration. It doesn't lessen the orchestration at all. It's still full strings and trumpet and oboe. And it picks up on the notion of the turbulence again, of the big smack, of the coming of Jesus the second time around, and how we are to be alert to that. But the movement is decisively separated into two parts. The first 8 measures mark the division. And after the first 8 measures, the words in the text are doch euch, which is like je doch. It's another version. Doch euch means and yet you, and so on. So that begins the second part, and the foreboding gradually dissipates. And as a matter of fact, the soloist gets all involved in the expression of joy, looking forward to the joy of Christ's coming as well for the faithful. And his melisma on joy is just magnificent. And he suddenly relies on triplets. And triplets always give the sense of special joy. They're sort of a dance rhythm. So listen for, in the second movement, this contrast between judgment and comfort, and see how the recitative keeps the energy going of the first movement, but begins to dissipate it a little bit towards the end, in the sense that we can experience joy in the midst of all that. Movement 3 is the first of the 4 arias. The arias, by the way, are magnificently constructed, and each one of them is quite tunable as you walk away with these melodies buzzing in your head. It would be appropriate at this point to take a look at example A, because example A is, in fact, the first measures of the score of aria number 3. And see what Bach does here. It's sort of interesting. What he does is he reflects the librettist text. And the librettist in this text is moving outside the Gospels to other biblical material to support this notion of the second coming of Christ and what that means. And what he goes for is the deliverance from Egypt. And he said, Christ's coming is like being delivered from Egypt. And it's like being delivered from Sodom. Sodom becomes a favorite, I suppose, because of the notion of fire, and that's always kind of connected with the second coming of Christ. So the notion is that Jesus helps us by his coming to get out of Egypt, to set us free. But the fact of the matter is that in this life, we're never freed completely from our Egypts, as they were. And so Bach, I think, tries to demonstrate that in the construction of this aria. If you look at the music itself, the top line there is a bunch of rests. That's for the soloist. That comes later. But the next line down is the cello. And the cello is the chief melodic instrument at this point. But the cello is breaking out of the bass line, which is right below it. So the bass line below it will probably be played by a bassoon and maybe bass violin. But the cello comes out of that. And while it's still connected to it, still part of it, it begins to sense a freedom from it. And you get to the second line, you see it begin to soar in the second and third measures. So there's this notion of breaking out of Egypt that gets carried through with the cello and the bass. In the New Testament, this is talked about as the terms of being in the world but not of the world. And so this is Bach's way of doing that. It's hard to hear, so I'm going to suggest that we also listen to a little bit of it. Perhaps we can play, maybe the first, let's see, the first 12 or 13 measures. and you can hear that. The fourth movement is a very short recitative, another one of those that was prepared for the Leipzig version, and is nothing to write home about musically, but the text affirms what was said in movement 3. So it's saying, well, that's the way it is. We need to be freed from our Egypts, and this is what's happening. Then comes movement number 5. And this would be a time to look at example B. This is the second of the third arias, and the text is again fascinating. The librettist picks up on the notion that it's always been the case in the history of the church that when it becomes serious about waiting for the Christ and becomes serious about knowing our place in this world and where we will be going and the new creation and all that, it's common that there's always people around to mock. People that say, are you kidding? And they were there in the New Testament. They were there throughout the history of the church. They are there today. So the notion of the text is that tongues are wagging, and the tongues are wagging and mocking the sincere faith of the Christians who are looking for the coming of Christ. Now, how's Bach going to do that? That's a unique kind of technique he's got here. If you look carefully at the strings that are playing in unison on the top line, you'll notice that sometimes several of them drop out. So in the end of the first measure into the second, the viola and second violin drop out, and the first violin continues on. And so there's a sense of strong sound, weak sound. And then if you look at the notes themselves, they're sort of imitative. They take the material from right before it and do it again. And so we're sort of reminded of what young children often experience when they're in great difficulty and bullies are around. They'll say, I'm going to go get my mommy. And the bullies then say, I'm going to go get my mommy. And so that's kind of what's happening here, is that the strings are making a statement, and then a few of them, the mocker is going, yeah, 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 yeah. And this goes on for the entire movement. I've bracketed out the sections where the imitation stuff comes, kind of a despairing imitation, in between the first measure and second, and then from the end of the second into the third. And the clearest example is there in measures 5 and 6, where you see that imitation happening. It would be good to listen to a little bit of this as well. Maybe let's see what we could listen to. Maybe measures 1 through 7, just to get a sense of what's happening here. Movement number 6 is another short recitative, not worth commenting on at this point, but it's also important to note that the text of this recitative starts out, or at least includes the word "ye doch." And yet God remembers God's servants. And then that is concluded and brings to an end the first part of the cantata by a chorale, which was newly added in Leipzig and consists of stanza 10 of a hymn that we don't know anymore, and apparently there was never a really good translation, Freudig Sehr, but it was a hymn that was dearly loved in Bach's time and before, and it was a hymn that was identified as a hymn for the coming, for a blessed death. So there is that kind of connection there. What we do recognize about the hymn is the tune. It's a very popular tune today. We know it probably best with the text, "Comfort, comfort ye my people." And so it has a kind of an Advent cast to it, which is not a bad thing in terms of this cantata. And it was a favorite tune of Bach. He said it many, many times. So that's a good way to end the cantata. Part two of the cantata, as we said earlier, happened during communion. So as we talk about the next movements, envision in your mind people going to communion there at St. Thomas, that there is distribution going on, and this music now is accompanying all of that. This music provides a kind of a background to that and helps us understand what's going on. The first aria continues the very positive note of the chorale and the recitative that preceded it. It continues with the words, "Lift up your heads, be comforted. You are headed for Eden," which is the Garden of Eden, obviously. People are communing, and so they are partaking of the food of the angels, the food of the garden, as it were. So the initial part of the theme of this particular aria is kind of interesting. Because commentators have pointed out that not only does the theme represent a very whistleable, lovely tune, in fact, it becomes an earworm almost, but the first notes of it seem to be based on a hymn tune. And the hymn tune is one that we know with the text, "O God, our faithful God." O God, our faithful God. So those notes, those opening notes, sort of become the structural skeleton for what Bach invents then for the strings and oboe as they take us through this aria. It would be appropriate to hear a few measures of this so we get it into our ear, maybe measures 1 through 13. So the positive nature of this aria now sort of takes a turn for the terror side again. And the recitative that follows begins with the German word ach, which means oh, or another jedoch, and yet. And so the recitative is in two-part form. The dreaded day, the resounding smack, the pulsating bass in the recitative sends the agitation of the day and its fact that it's coming towards us. And there are falling and rising string figures to do the same thing. But all of that ends in measure 14 with a pause. And after that pause comes, guess what? The word jedoch. And gradually after that, the entire recitative quiets down and comes to a very lovely expression of joy again. Now, if that were the end of it, it'd be wonderful all by itself. But because this is a new piece in Leipzig, this is one of those newly composed recitatives, Bach decides to do more with it. And so the text of the recitative begins either with its first phrase or second, talking about Jesus coming with the sound of the trumpet. Right at that moment, the trumpet plays a hymn tune above all that's going on in the recitative and just gives us pieces of the tune for the remainder of the duration of the recitative. Now, what is the hymn tune that the trumpet player is playing? Well, it's a tune and a text that we knew better 50 years ago in older hymnals. The day is surely drawing near is what the English translation was. And it was a hymn that was a German translation of the Dies Irae, done back in the 17th century, I believe. So the hymn text apparently has a specific stanza that Bach had in mind, and here it seems to be. So right after the trumpet sounds, the hymn text would be this: "A trumpet then shall loud resound, and all the earth be shaken. But all that live shall in that hour, by the Almighty's boundless power, be changed at its commanding." So the hymn text itself sort of changes its color. So it starts out, with judgment and the loud smack of the second coming, but sort of then gradually moves as the recitative moves into a sense of comfort and being changed with God's coming. Bach was able to do this by layering musical ideas. It's something that composers can do and other artists cannot do quite as well. And he does it frequently with chorales, which, suddenly come poking away at your mind and your memory and generates thoughts that the tune itself carries. This then is followed by the final aria. It's a three-part aria, and it's a song of yearning is the first part of it. And then come sound, crack, final blow. And then the third part is a plea to Jesus to bring this to a joyful, full end. It starts with no instrumental accompaniment. The soloist begins by himself, and it's so lyrical. Enjoy it. It's one of those moments in Bach where you wonder how he had these tools and skills to write these gorgeous melodies. But be alert again to the contrasts that are there in the aria. And they are split and they are announced very drastically. In this case, with the three words that amount to sound, crack, and final blow. They suddenly pop up in his lyrical aria and bring back the terror and the existential dread. But all of that comes to an end at the end of that aria. And the cantata then ends with the final stanza of a hymn that many of us remember, "My dear Jesus, I'll not leave." "Meinem Jesum lasse ich nicht," I think is the German. However, it's sung to a tune that we don't know. It was a tune that Bach's people knew. In fact, it was well loved at his time. So unfortunately, we have to make that bridge. The text is about not leaving Jesus, Jesus not leaving us, and enjoying the fullness of the time to come. Noticeable about this is that Bach's setting is not just simply a four-part choral setting with instrumental support, but he adds three independent soaring string lines to amount then to a seven-part setting, which is pretty full, folks. It's a full kind of sound, which is exactly, I think, what he was trying to achieve with the notion of fullness. And one other cute little thing to carry you into the cantata now is that the very last chord of the chorale has as its lowest note a C, and its highest note is a C. They're 4 octaves apart, and at the time of Bach, with exceptions, of course, but still at the time of Bach, this was considered the playground in which composers did their playing, their composing. This was called the gamut, from that low C to the high C. Those were all the notes that were available. Occasionally, of course, Bach goes beyond, and other composers do too, and then after their time gets pushed beyond, so they would get huge keyboards like on the piano and so on. But at the time, it was the fullness of the gamut, and he tries to fill all the sounds in the midst. Yes, so from Advent to 26th Sunday after Trinity, enjoy this cantata. That's probably not a good word. Let the cantata edify you. It's got a lot of that and a lot of promise and a lot of comfort, and Bach is not stingy with it. Thank you.